as Matt was introducing me, I'm looking across the conference room, and it just makes me so happy to see all these beautiful faces. It just brings home how diverse Africa is and how beautiful it is. I've had the privilege of traveling 43 out of the 54 African countries. So I've probably been to some of your countries. Every place I've gone in Africa, I've enjoyed myself tremendously. You know, from the food to the culture to everything. In terms of Mali, since we're talking about Mali, I've traveled northern Mali extensively. I've been to Kidal, Agalhouk, Bourem, Gao, Timbuktu. Did about 40 missions up in the northern parts of Mali. I've been in northern Niger. I've been in Mauritania and across into Chad and right on the border of Sudan. So I've seen the events unfold. Now, going back, I'm going to try to go from, as we say in the States, I'm going to go from the 50,000-foot level, from very high up as we're looking at the problem, and I'm going to slowly come down into the problem set of Mali. So bear with me for a few minutes as I try to set the stage. When I was in Côte d'Ivoire, between 2001 to 2003, as some of you recall, Côte d'Ivoire went through a coup d'etat in 2002. What was really interesting about what happened in the coup d'etat is not only did it affect Côte d'Ivoire, but it also affected landlocked countries in the northern part of Africa, mainly Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And because Côte d'Ivoire is a francophone country, it was providing the goods that were going into these landlocked countries in the north. So there was the port of Abidjan that was used, and if you draw a line from the port of Abidjan going straight north, it looks like a spinal column going through the center of Côte d'Ivoire, and it fed in economically into those landlocked countries. After the coup, what happened is the spinal column, the route that was providing the goods into those landlocked countries, ended up shifting several years later over to Ghana. So Accra became that port that was feeding those northern countries. During this time frame, what happened is it impacted the economies to some extent of Burkina, of Mali, of Niger. Politically, some folks were looking for ways to make money. As we go from 2002 into 2005, we start to see something very unique that begins happening in West Africa, which caught the attention of the world, and that is narco trafficking. We start seeing an increase in narcotics coming into West Africa, mainly from the shorelines and sometimes bypassing the shorelines from places like Guinea-Bissau and going into places like Mali. And from there, it began spreading across the northern countries of Africa and into Europe. Europe was the end recipient of the narco trafficking that was coming through. This narco trafficking fueled was the impetus or the point where you have people from within governments, whether it's small or big, that got involved in the narco trafficking and were making money in their own pocket. But it also fed into the terrorism that was growing in the northern part of Mali, i.e. GSPC, which later on became known as AQIM or ACMI in French. I'm trying to set the stage here for you. Now, so everybody knows that there's a narcotics problem in this region that goes beyond just West Africa. It actually extends beyond West Africa all the way out towards the east, because some of the drugs filter up through Libya, they filter through Egypt, they filter through Sudan, and then they go up through Algeria. So everybody is inclusive. In addition to the narco trade, we also have the weapons influx that have been cycling through the region. Now, let me shift a little bit over because I'm trying to paint different layers of the problem. So we're going to leave the narco trafficking and the weapons trafficking for a minute, and now let's go to the story of Mali itself. Okay. Looking at Mali, we go back to the history of Mali. Before Mali's independence in the 1960s, in 1960, we have some major issues going on in the north, primarily with the Touareg. Essentially, the Touareg had no boundaries. They moved and shifted between various countries, 5 to be exact. Very nomadic, but under French rule, what we see is as Mali was divided, we start seeing boundaries and limitations on movement of some of the Touareg. What we also have is the central governments, like in Bamako, were imposing or levying taxes on the people of the north. When Mali gets its independence in 1960, moving into 1961, late 1962, we see the first Touareg rebellion. Not all Touareg were on board with this rebellion. Only a group of Touareg rebelled. Bamako moves forward. They crush the rebellion by 1964. The Touareg get dispersed, but the state was so heavy-handed in responding to the rebellion in the north that it even alienated or got people that were not involved in this rebellion very angry and very upset. So this kind of set the stage for the next rebellion, which takes place in the 1990s. And that second rebellion was even more vicious than the first one, because the rebels that were involved in the first rebellion in the 1960s got more sophisticated, they got more weapons, and they tried to revolt again against the central government for some grievances that are easily addressed. One, the Touareg recognized their identity within their language. They call themselves Kel Tamashek, which is the people of the Tamashek speaking language. And so when you have the state in the south trying to impose itself on the north, primarily saying, you have to learn Bambara, we don't want you speaking your language, we don't want you identifying yourself in your language. What that does is starts creating more rift. Other things in their grievances were they wanted basic schools, they wanted basic health care, they wanted paved roads. That didn't happen. So what you have in the 90s is Algeria injecting itself in the process and trying to help resolve these differences that we found between the north and the south. A lot of promises were made, but these promises didn't come to fruition. And so by 2006, there was a third rebellion. And the third rebellion was even more violent than the first two. And you can see the trend that keeps growing. So the third rebellion goes between 2006 to 2009, and then it was subdued and crushed. At the head of this rebellion was a guy named Agbahanga. Agbahanga was a strong rebel, and when the rebellion was crushed by 2009, Bahanga was exiled from Mali, and he ended up in Libya. Well, in Libya, Gaddafi had spent a lot of time building his Touareg capability, because he had these desert units that were capable to fight in the southern regions. Bahanga went up and started to look for people who were like him, Touareg. Amongst them, one guy named Agnajim. Agnajim today is the head of the military side of the secular Touareg called the MNLA, but I'll get to that in a second. So he begins talking to the various Touareg within these desert units, and now we're talking 2011. Everybody starts seeing events unfolding in Libya, and Western powers were behind the uprising to oust Gaddafi out of his country. And so the Touareg kind of thought to themselves, this is a great opportunity. We have access to weapons. We also have access to officers who are well trained. Why don't we put things together? And it was Bahanga's brainchild to kind of bring this capability into Mali. Well, they had to cross. They ended up crossing from Libya in through Niger and then across into Mali. And so the weapons started to build in that capability. The Touareg had met in a place called Zakak, which is right on the border of Algeria in the northern part of Mali, and they had discussed the things that had gone wrong in previous rebellions, in the first, second, and third rebellion. And so they identified a few things that went wrong, and they kind of collectively got together and they said, well, in the last three rebellions, there are things that we were missing. One, we didn't have sophisticated weapons, but now we do. Number two, we were not collectively, we were not a unit together. We were very divided as people. We need to bring ourselves together. And oh, by the way, the Touareg are not the only people in northern Mali. There are other people here. We have Kunta Arabs, we have Berabish, we have Bellas, we have different ethnic groups, so we need to include them into our process. So there was an attempt to bring them into the process. And then the last thing they also discussed is the fact that there was not enough media attention to what they were doing. So they wanted to bring this process in, and so they turned to the Touareg youth and they said, we want you to tell the world what we're doing. So this all happens in October of 2011. They get together. Well, prior to this meeting, Bahanga dies in a mysterious car accident in August of 2011. So he didn't see the formation of the MNLA, or the Mouvement National pour la Libération d'Azawad, as they call it. And so he disappears, but guys like Agnajim, Bilal Al-Sharif, various Tuaregs all got together and they continue this vision forward. From October of 2011, they begin to send special emissaries down to Bamako to talk to President Amadou Toumani Touré, ATT, and basically explain to him that they are in the process, they put together a group called the MNLA, they're in the process of rebelling. That they would like to table discussions for grievances that were never dealt with in the past. So ATT, in his wisdom, said, well, you know, we've defeated these guys before, why don't we start sending our troops to the north to crush them? The MNLA waits 3.5 months, they make this concerted diplomatic effort, and as these troops are starting to head north, what happens is the MNLA says, we can see them coming, why don't we just go ahead and rebel because that's what we're going to do. Now, let me step back for one minute and explain that in the process of them forming themselves as a group in Zakak in October 2011, there was a very odd individual that shows up, and his name is Iyad Aghali. That is the emir of today's group Ansari, who was recently put on the state sponsor of terrorism list and also is also labeled by the UN as a terrorist. Iyad has an interesting history. Without going too deeply into it, Iyad had embraced more of a Salafi way of life, became a jihadi, but also had some deep connections with AQIM that was operating in northern Mali. He approaches the MNLA and he says, I want to be part of your group. And they said, absolutely not, we want nothing to do with you. So he said, fine, I will fight alongside with you and I'll bring my friends, AQIM, to fight alongside because you want to liberate the northern part of Mali, which the MNLA was calling Azawad. So they moved together, and this is when the press, in January of 2012, the fourth rebellion begins and they begin to push south. There was tremendous confusion in the press because they start seeing the MNLA moving south and they go, are they secular Touareg? Or who are these Islamists that are with them? Who is this Ansari group and why is AQIM working with them? So all of a sudden, the news agencies started getting it very confused. They weren't sure if the Touareg were part of the rebellion were terrorists. They weren't terrorists. So if you go back and take a look at the news, it was very confusing. Well, what happened is the Touareg take control over northern Mali, a geographic space the size of France. And this happens from January 17th of 2012, and they finish taking over northern Mali by April 6th, 2012. So within 2.5 months, they actually take full control of northern Mali. Well, this got everybody thinking, oh my God, what's going on over here? The Touareg now move into a position to try to administer control over this large territory. They get into a debate with the Islamists from AQIM and from Ansari, and the debate was whether to this land called Azawad now, that they call the northern part of Mali that they conquered, is it administered under Sharia law or not? The MNLA said absolutely not. We're secular, we don't care what anybody believes in, we welcome everybody, but we do not want Sharia as part of it. So they clashed, and the whole time AQIM is trying to take control over this thing. By June of 2012, a fight occurs in Gao at the headquarters of the MNLA, and the MNLA gets pushed out, and what you have now is the MNLA gets pushed over towards Menaka, towards the eastern side of Mali, and then also towards the western side of Mali, a place called Léré, and then to the northeastern side towards Kidal and Tessalit. The Islamists take over and control over northern Mali, and then what we see is a buildup of Sharia law that starts spreading throughout these towns and cities of Timbuktu and Gao and different places. And then what we see by January of this year is an explosion of the Islamists moving southward into Kona with the whole goal of taking over all of Mali and controlling it under something called Sharia. But what's really interesting also is if you go back into radical jihadi forums online, looking back to April of 2012, you'll see a map of West Africa with all of Mali painted in black and the words Allahu Akbar in the middle of it. Looks very much like the black flag that AQIM had, with arrows going in different directions up towards Algeria, towards Libya, across the desert into Nigeria, and all the way towards Sudan. Their goal, their end goal, is to control that whole geographic space, but they wanted to use Mali as a center for it. The bottom line is, with all this complexities of terrorism, we also have a complexity of ethnic tensions between the north and the south. Some people say it's beyond that. Now, one thing to point out, it's not just a Touareg problem or it's not a Bambara problem from Bamako, it's far more complex than this. Because today, as we see, the French operations are yielding some very interesting dynamics. For example, right across the river from Gao, only a couple of days ago, there was an operation with Mali forces going across, and they captured a town called Kaji, and they found a bunch of people supporters that are Songrai. So you start looking at all these ethnic groups, and it gets very complex to understand. So I know I'm painting a complicated picture here. How am I doing on time? Okay. 10 more minutes? 10 more minutes. Okay, I got 10 more minutes. So let me complicate this a little bit more for you. Okay. So now, I'm doing layers. So we have Mali here. We have the first layer I talked about is narco trafficking. The second layer we have is terrorism. The third layer we have is ethnic tensions in the different pockets of Mali. When France intervenes in January of this year, what we see is Mali soldiers and Mali police officers involved in finding anybody that is light-skinned Arab or Touareg and killing them. We have documented the Human Rights Watch from here and in overseas documented over 200 killings. And they were just killings of just innocent people. 2 women in Timbuktu were minding their own business. Just because they were the wrong ethnic group, they were killed. We also have them in Djabili. We have them in Yono. I can go on and on and on. Now, there are, to the credit of France, and to the credit of some people in Bamako, there's been some arrests in stopping sergeants, corporals, or officers that are involved in these killings. However, they still remain. So how do you build a country? Question number one is, how do you build a country with all these layers of complexities on top of it? There's so many layers that it's very interesting to address. How do you bring the people together when you have these tensions and divisions that have been going on, not just for a year, but they've been going on for decades, well past Mali's independence in 1960. And then also, now we're trying to take an international force, a FISMA, which is made up of many of your countries. So we have Niger, and I'd welcome, I know there's somebody here from Niger, I'd welcome your comments. We have people from Niger, troops from Nigeria, from Senegal, from Togo, from everywhere across West Africa, which is wonderful. I think it's great. However, we need to also, as we bring in these peacekeeping, these military forces in, what we need to do is take into account also historical dynamics that have similarly occurred in neighboring countries. For example, whenever there's been a rebellion in Mali with the Touareg, shortly after you see also a rebellion happen in Niger. Chad also has a history of having to deal with the Touareg. So now if you take these individuals into an FISMA capacity and put them in Mali, you also might have some backlash from within the population. What we have to do is win the population over. And so the thought is, and the question to you is, how do we do that? How do we make sure that these people in the north, be it Touareg, be it Kunta, be it Barabish, be it Bella, that they are not going to rebel in some case and give the chance of these Islamists, these radicals that have been pushed out into different pockets, to come back and exploit the population for suicide bombings that we're seeing for the first time ever in Mali. The last thing we want to do is Mali soldiers coming out and killing people, innocent people, and then the people turn against them, and therefore you have a bigger problem that becomes not only centered around Mali, but it spills over into places like Niger, it spills over into places like Mauritania, and it starts impacting the northern countries like Morocco and Algeria and Libya and whatnot. These are very important questions, and the collective, and I'm very excited to hear your questions, because I think that's important. That's something we need to discuss here today and see if we can come up with some ideas. Can I leave it at that?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Is that okay? All right. So